Okay, today's daf we're learning today is daf Eruvin daf Pehe. Today's daf is dedicated by Gita Neufeld in honor of the Hadran English Zoom shiur with deepest gratitude for your care and concern. As his son is scary emergency waiting room, unable to be at my husband's bedside because of COVID regulations, the shiur was my anchor and my rock. Baruch Hashem, we were able to come home and I managed to complete the daf. Hodul Hashem kitov, kili olam chaska. Shiat refuah shlema. Okay, we're going to start from the bottom of Pedalad Amud Bet. Amal Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Bor sheben shtei chatzerot mufleget mikotel ze arba'a mikotel ze arba'a. We're having a new case now. I just want to refresh your memory. We ended yesterday with this case about Shmuel, which we're going to come back to. So I'll review it for a quick minute. We tried to bring it as a proof for Rav's approach, and then we tried to bring it. Let me just refer. Right, it was a proof for Rav, and then we basically said no. But we talked about this roof. If you remember, the roof borders on Reshut Harabim, and it also leads to the house. If there's no ladder that's permanent between the roof and the house, we assume that the homeowner doesn't really use his roof as so much. He doesn't have exclusive ownership over the roof. And the people in Reshut Harabim have access to the roof. So because of that, first we tried to say maybe it was less than 10 tefachim. In the end, we say, well, it could be 10 tefachim. How do the people in the Reshut Harabim have access? Because maybe they put light loads on, like a hat or a sheet or a handkerchief or something light, and that they can easily do at the height of 10 tefachim. I did some research into this issue of 10 tefachim. I think the way to understand it, and I spoke to Shuli Mishkin, who writes for Flashback. We had talked to it in the Zoom after class. Maybe we should suggest she write an article about it. So she looked into a little, and she reminded me of the fact that the idea of 10 tefachim really comes from the idea of 10 tefachim being a reshut. It comes from the Aron, number one, is one issue. It comes from Dinei Nezikin, with like the depth of a pit, that's a height at which someone will fall in the pit where an animal might fall in and die. Okay, whereas less than 10, it won't. It'll just get injured. So we use this, even if you might say 10 tefachim is pretty short, and maybe you could still assume people in those days, Art had quoted to me after class that there's proof that the people were shorter in those days, okay, average height of about 62 inches, 5'2". Still, 10 tefachim is pretty low, but the idea is that we take this concept that appears in other places where the idea of the Aron being where the presence of God is, and it's within there's this height of 10 tefachim, the significance of the 10 tefachim height there, and we take that also to other places. It's this idea that that's our height, even if maybe it's not 100% not accessible, but that's our height, that we use that shiur for all sorts of things. It's possible, it's a direction to go in. Still 100% doesn't answer our questions, but the idea being that that's what we consider one reshut. Above that is already a different reshut, okay? And like I said, it's really learned out from the Aron, and you can also learn it in terms of depth from Dinei Nezikin. Okay, so now we're going to start with another section. What we're going to say now is a halacha in the name of Shmuel. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda quotes Shmuel. Pay attention to the people here. This will be important. Bor sheben shtei chatzerot. So if you have a well between, or a ditch between two houses, okay, let's look at the pictures. We have picture number 287. We have a well here. It's in between two courtyards. Now, what's important to note, the picture is very helpful. The picture tells you all sorts of things that Rashi tells you, which is number one, how are they accessing the water from their courtyards? Through a window. They don't have a door to this area. If they had doors to this area, this would be a classic area between two courtyards that everyone has access to, and therefore, if they didn't make an eruv, they forbid each other. That would be the case. But no one really has access here, so no one really uses this space. The only way they use this space is to get the water from the well through their windows. Now, this is what we're going to call later derech avir. This is through airspace. It's not, and if you noticed, it said here, it's mufleget mikotel ze arba'a. That was the shiur we used the other day. If it's 4 away, it's already less accessible. So it's not so accessible. You have to get through airspace to get there. Okay, so now, in order to allow, now theoretically what we're going to see is that the Shmuel requires you to fix this, but Rashi is going to tell us that really, if you look in the middle of Rashi, Dibor Matchil Motzi Ziz Kol Shehu, in the middle, it's a very long Rashi. Right in the center there, the first word on the line is libai. He says, Ela mishum heker ba'alma. You don't really need this, but it's to make an indication to teach people that just in case there was a case where there weren't 4 tvachim of space and it was easily accessible to both sides, then they would forbid each other. So in this case, we're going to make some sort of noticeable mark so that people know that in a similar case, we'd have to fix it. Okay, but here they're not accessible either way, but ze motzi ziz kol shehu mimale, v'ze motzi ziz kol shehu mimale. So each one is allowed access to this space as long as they put some sort of something jutting out of their wall. It can be very small, it can be short, doesn't have to be here. It looks like it's probably 4 tvachim, but it doesn't have to be. I don't know why they did the picture that way, because it doesn't really have to be 4 tvachim. It says kol shehu, any size is fine, as long as there's some indication that we're doing something to allow us to carry. And then that will remind us that in a space where, let's say, the well was bigger and it really reached up to the walls, or the walls were narrower and they were very close to the bore, then it would be a space where 2 people have equal access, easy access, and it would be forbidden. So because of that, we put up this ziz kol shehu mimale. Rav Yehuda didei. So Rav Yehuda himself says, okay, I told you, pay attention to the people. Rav Yehuda said this in the name of Shmuel. If you recall, he learned by Rav, and then after Rav's death, he learned by Shmuel, and he's always quoting Rav and Shmuel. So the first halach he quotes in the name of Shmuel, and then he himself says, not in Shmuel's name, but he himself says, Amar afilu kanya, even a reed, even something, it doesn't have to be wooden, serious, right, of any size. It could even be a reed, something flimsy. It just needs to be some sort of indicating mark. Now we're going to have this line of Abai, which you'd have to understand that Abai didn't have the sugya the way we had it. We had Rav Yehuda said the name of Shmuel, and then we have Rav Yehuda kind of added on to Shmuel and said, well, it doesn't have to be a ziz, it could be even a reed. But Abai didn't know that Rav Yehuda quoted the first line in the name of Shmuel. So we kind of have to erase what we learned in the beginning of class, and then we're going to get back there again soon. Amar le Abai le Rav Yosef, ha de Rav Yehuda de Shmuel hi, de I de Rav, ha-amar ein adam oser al chavero derech avir. So basically, he makes this statement Abai that Rav Yehuda must have been holding by Shmuel, because this is a case of what we said before. I said they're using derech avir, meaning how do they get to this space? They get to it through airspace, meaning difficulty, right? It's not an easy access, it's difficult access. So because of that, we're going to see, even though, what does Shmuel say? Even though each can only get there by difficulty, not in an easy manner, we're still going to say they forbid each other unless you put up the ziz. Now, it's true, he says it's only for a noticeable, right, for a heker, for just so people know that they don't make a mistake in other cases, but in the end, it doesn't really matter because he still forbids derech avir. Whereas, according to Abaye, this must be only Shmuel, because Rav doesn't hold that this is a problem. Rav thinks that if you have it very inaccessible, you have to get there through airspace, right, which is more than 4 tvachim, then it's not like you actually have use. Again, this is all a matter of what do we consider use or not? Is this usable for me? It's not really so usable easily, so we're not going to call this use. Okay, now, the question we're going to ask, again, imagine we didn't have the beginning of what we started off with today. So now we're going to say, number one, we're going to say, where did we learn that Shmuel, where did Abaye know that Shmuel says this? Number two, we're going to say, where did Rav know, where did Abaye know that Rav doesn't hold this way? Okay, and I'm going to show you right now the chart, in case you don't have it in front of you. It's going to be the very same structure for both cases. We're going to have, first we have already, Abaye told us what each one holds about derech havir. Shmuel says, each person forbids each person forbids the other person, even though it's not super accessible. And Rav says, ein adam oser al chavero. One doesn't forbid the other if it's inaccessible to both. Then for each of them, we're going to have a first attempt to bring a source for how do we know that Shmuel says this and how do we know that Rav says this. And each time they're going to bring, oh, well, Shmuel said this. And someone said, Rav said this. And each of those attempts, the first attempt for each one is going to be rejected. And we're going to say, no, that's not the same thing. And then they're going to bring a second approach. And from the second attempt, they're going to actually prove where he knows that Shmuel says, Adam Oser al Chavero, and where we're going to know that Rav says he doesn't forbid the other, derech havir. So that's going to be the next structure for the structure for the next section. So let's read inside. So now he says, U'de Shmuel mehecha. Where did he get that Shmuel says this? right? This isn't Abaye speaking. This is the Gemara trying to figure out what was so obvious to Abaye. Where was it so obvious to him from? So maybe it's from what we saw at the end of yesterday, which is Rav Nachman said in the name of Shmuel, so now that's a case where the roof is inaccessible to the people in the public domain. And we're going to learn something we didn't learn yesterday. We said yesterday it was very accessible to them because they can just, right? Remember we said the roof bordered on Rishut Rabim. That would be accessible. But we're going to say, no, it's not so accessible. Rashi explains why. Because if you look in Rashi, it's much further down on the page, about 8 lines from where the lines get wide. The second line of that Rashi, he says at the end of the second line, he says, Distam Rishut Rabim ika chipufe samuch lekotali umitrachakim al korchan. You know, there's places in the street where we're worried we don't want a car to come close, so they put those poles in the ground, those low poles, so the car can't get there, but people can walk through. So apparently they put up things like that near their houses so that they obviously weren't worried about cars, but wagons or things like that might bump into their walls. And they were worried their walls weren't so strong, it might knock down the wall. So they would put things around their house to prevent things from getting close to the house. And apparently it also prohibited pedestrians from getting close to their house. So because of these chipufe, we're going to assume that the access of the people in the public domain to the roof is derech avir. Okay, we're going to assume that the chipufe covered a space of more than 4 tvachim, and therefore their access was from a distance. If that's the case, what do you see here? Even though their access is from a distance, if there's no sulam kavua, there's no permanent ladder there, then what are we going to say? We're assuming that the people in Rishut Rabim, in the public domain, have access. If they have access, then basically, right, that's called shimush derech avir. So we're going to say no, dilma kederaf papa. Oh no, you could say maybe they were just using it for hats and other things. Now hats, to put a hat 4 tvachim of distance, right? Think about 4 tvachim. It's not very, right? It's less than a cubit. Okay, so remember, a cubit is 5 or 6 tvachim. To put your hat, right? Maybe a bag that's heavy, it'll be hard to move to the roof at a distance of 4 tvachim, but a hat or something very light is not going to be very difficult. So you can't say that's our proof for Shmuel. So moving on. Ela meha, and this is where we would have wanted to start because we already knew the answer to this, right? It's rare that we know more than you know, the people speaking in the Gemara, right? We obviously know more because they told us already. But ela meha, let's learn it from here. Ze motzi ziz kol shu mimale, v'ze motzi ziz kol shu mimale. Right? What do you learn from here? Tama da apik, halo apik, right? The whole reason it works is because you put out this ziz. Sounds like if you didn't put out the ziz, and remember, it was said in the name of Shmuel, and that's what we're looking for. Halo apik, amrina nadamo sera chavero derech avir. If you didn't put that ziz out, it would be forbidden. And why is that? Because a person forbids somebody else derech avir, even if his access is inaccessible because he has to go far to get his, like this obviously would be much more difficult than a hat. This is getting your pail all the way over to the well, picking it up, bringing it back over. That already is much less accessible. And yet Shmuel says, since both of them have, not great access, but they do have some sort of access, they're going to forbid each other. So there's our proof for Shmuel. Now we want to know, what about Rav? How do we know that Rav holds that ein adam oser al chavero derech avir? Okay, that this wouldn't forbid. But Amar Rafun, where am I? Stig Zustrot, sorry. Sorry, I lost my space. Okay. Udirav mehecha. Okay, we're about 12 lines from the bottom. I figure if I lost my place, maybe you did too. Udirav mehecha. Oh, this is great. We're going back again to what we saw yesterday, right? The first attempt are both things that we saw already yesterday, which is maybe when there's 2 gezuz traot, remember that? Each one had this balcony coming out of his house. They made a hole, right, in one of them, and mechitzot, walls going down so that, right, even though they didn't go all the way down to the water, so that he could put his pail in and bring up the water. So if I have a gezuz traot like that, and you have one next to mine, am I allowed to draw, and you didn't make a mechitza? Do we say that you're going to forbid mine because you're going to use mine, and therefore you're going to forbid me? So let's read. If you have shei gezustra zolam alamizo, one is higher than the other, remember, the one that was lower was off to the side, not directly below or directly above, but to the side, right? It would have to be directly below. But anyway, lower and to the side. Asu mechitza le'elyona, the higher one had a mechitza, velo asu mechitza latachtona, but the lower one didn't. So the lower one doesn't have access to the water through his own gezustra or her own gezustra. Shtehen asurot ad shiarvu. Neither one can draw water through the hole in my gezustra until we make an eruv, because you have access to my gezustra. So therefore, it's considered like both of ours. And if we didn't make an eruv, we're not allowed. The Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav. Now we want to find Rav. And we want to find Rav who says, derech avir doesn't forbid. So how are we going to have this? Well, Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, lo shanu ela b'smucha. They're only going to forbid each other if they're right next to each other. Alva b'mufleget arba'a. If the gezustra, the lower one, is 4 tvachim away from the higher one, then we're going to say, el yona muteret v'tachtona asura. Then you're not going to forbid me. I can draw water because you're already 4 away. And your access, is we're going to say, is derech avir, is through airspace. That's already difficult access, and therefore you're not going to forbid me. So there you see, Rav says derech avir doesn't forbid. But if you remember, I already told you, the first attempt is going to be rejected, just like our first attempt of Shmuel. So how's the Gemara going to reject it? The Gemara says, no, dil mashane hacha, de kevan de lezeb zrika v'shel shulu, lezeb shel shul l'chude, ke lezeb zrika u lezeb petach dame. Now, before, if you remember, 2 dapim ago, at the end of Pei Gimel Amud Bet, we had Rav's approach, who said that even if the percentages of how difficult it is are different, remember, he said still both are forbidden, even if one's a little more noach than the other. However, in this case, this isn't a matter of percentages. This is a matter of what's required for me to get from my gezustra down. I have to just lower the pail, right? That's called shulshul. I lower it down. That's my access. What's your access? You have to do 2 things. You have to, it's not just that percentage-wise, it's more difficult for you, but action-wise, you have to do double the amount of actions that I have to do. You have to throw it over to me because it's more than 4. It's already distance. You have to throw it over and then you have to put it down. That's already a case where Rav is going to say that's already very inaccessible for one and less inaccessible for the other. And even Rav is going to think that that's okay. So now we're going to show that has nothing to do with derech havir. It has to do with 2 actions versus 1, has nothing to do with derech havir. So this doesn't work. It's from the next statement that Rav is going to say. It's going to take a little bit longer. If you notice on the chart, this is a big section. So this is going to take a little longer till we get to the proof. So hold off on, don't think, oh, I should have understood this right away. We don't yet know how this is going to prove Rav, but we're going to start off by giving a case. Shnei batim, and we're also going to start with understanding the case in one way and then conclude that the case is actually different than we thought. Shnei batim v'shalosh churvot beinehem. Okay, let's assume we had a case similar to this. It wasn't churvot, but it was 2 houses. Remember, we had 2 courtyards with 3 houses in between, and the houses were open to each other. So it's kind of similar to that. We called it house A, B, C, D, and E. So we have 2 houses. A and E are houses. B, D, and E, which sound like they're in a row straight in between these 2 houses. I say sounds like because we're going to change it later. But right now we're going to assume 3 houses in a row, but they're not houses, they're churvot. Okay, here comes the picture. I'll bring it up. The picture shows that they're basically empty, desolate spaces, okay? And there's a breach in between each of the walls in between. So there's no real mechitza in between. So that means really A can get to B, D, and C pretty easily. B, C, and D. And E can also get to B, C, and D pretty easily, right? Now, A obviously could get to B more easily than the other house on the other side, right? And house E can easily get to the chorva number D, right? And the middle one is obviously equally accessible to both. So Rav's going to say what we kind of would have assumed. Now, the issue is each one can get, now if you notice in the picture, it says through the window. Okay, there's no opening from the houses. This is different from the case that we had last time because each house opened to the 3. Here, there's no opening. There's just a window. Now, a window's an opening, but it's not an easy access point. If you want to get something outside your house, you normally open the door and go through the door. You don't normally go through the window to get it. So, and also, especially if the item you want is on the ground, since the chorva is empty, whatever you're going to access is going to be on the ground, or you're going to throw it onto the ground. So if you have shnei batim v'shalosh churvot beinehem, ze mishtamesh b'samuch shelo al yedei zrika, v'ze mishtamesh b'samuch shelo al yedei zrika. Each one can throw out their window to the churva near them without having an eruv with the other person, right? A and E don't have to make an eruv with each other. They can each access the one next to them. And obviously, ha'emtza'i asur, the middle one is forbidden. So far, that's what Rav says. Yativ Rav Brona v'karma lahashmata. So Rav Brona was teaching this halacha. We had something very similar structure about Shmuel, actually. Amarle Rabbi Elazar, Barbe Rebbe Amar Rav Hachi, says, student of Rav, did Rav really say this? It doesn't make any sense that Rav would say this. Amarle, he says, yes, in fact, Rav said this. So what does Rabbi Elazar say? Amar achbeli ushpize. Show me your guest, meaning I'm going to ask Rav himself. I don't understand. Okay, right? Either I don't believe you, or I want to hear from Rav himself and have him explain to me. I'm going to ask him, don't you say this, and how do you explain it? So achbeli showed him where he is. Ata l'kamei de Rav, he comes up before Rav, Rabbi Elazar, and Amarle, Amar Mar Hachi, did you really say this about the churva? Amarle, he says, I did. So comes, now we finally find out what was bothering Rabbi Elazar. Amarle, v'ha marhu da'amar, aren't you the one who says, l'zeb shulshulu, l'zeb likash ne'am asurim? This is what we just said the other day, we learned the other day that I just mentioned. According to Rav, if each has access, but one, let's say it's 70% accessible, 30% not, and the other one is 30% accessible, 70% not. Rav doesn't care. He says shnehem asurim, they're both forbidden, because for both it's equally for both they're inaccessible, right? Maybe if it's two actions like shulshul and zrika, he might agree that it's only forbidden, that it would be permitted to the one who it's more accessible to. But when it's a matter of percentages, now let's look at this case. Theoretically, house E can throw into house B if it's a chorva B if he wanted. It's just less accessible, but he could throw there. If he has a good shot, he can throw. And A can throw all the way to D if he wanted, because again, it's all breached. There's nothing there. So theoretically, that should be a case that Rav should forbid because it's equally accessible to both. I'm sorry, it's not equally inaccessible to both, but it's inaccessible by zrika, right? By the same kind of thing. And even according to him, it could be zeb shulshul and zeb, bizrika. Still, he would forbid. So, how do you say this? So now he says to him, Rav answers, Amarle, misavar tekaime kishura, lo tekaime kechatzuva. And if you have a regular Gemara, there's picture. If you have a commentary, most of them have pictures here because it's very hard to understand without a picture. If you have the Koran, they have, I believe, 4 or 5 pictures. Many different opinions about what exactly this means, what the formation is. I'm going to go with the picture that's here that also happens to be the picture in my Gemara, which is you have 2 houses with windows. Now, if you split the space in half, okay, in half, going from one house to the other, you draw a line. Okay, I'm doing this for those who don't have a picture. And half of that space is split into 2, where you have access to one side and I have access to the other, which basically means, right, that's the place where we can each go into because it's right next to our houses. Versus the middle one is going to be forbidden because the middle one borders, the other half is going to be taken up by the other chorva entirely, meaning it's going to span the space from one house to the other house. And therefore, right, we're going to see that's why shnehem asurim, okay, because here everyone has equal access. And that's the case. And therefore, we're going to say that space is forbidden because everyone can get there the same way. Whereas the other 2 houses are basically, right, they each are next to only one of the houses, and therefore they're going to be permitted to each side. So now that was, right, this is where, now, what were we doing here? Do you remember? This was to show that ein adam oser al chavero derech havir. Now, how do you get from, okay, let's assume we had house C, which is all the way off, right? House C is in between A and E now equally, and that's why it's forbidden. But house B is close, chorva B, not house. Chorva B is close to A, house A, and chorva D is close to house E. But yet, theoretically, E can get to B and A can get to D. But how did they get there? Derech avir. They have to travel through one chorva to get to the other. There we see Rav doesn't forbid this. So there you have it. This is our proof that he doesn't forbid if you have to get there derech havir. Okay? If it's not easily accessible. So that resolves. So all we did today so far, I mean, not to undermine it, right? But what we did today so far to make it clear, the structure, we talked about Rav Yehuda quoted Shmuel about the Salacha about the Ziz. Then Rav Yehuda even added his own thing. Then Abaye tried to say, who was Rav Yehuda relying on? I know he was relying on Shmuel and not Rav. Then we basically tried to say, how do we know he was relying on Shmuel and that he holds by Adam Oser al Atzmo derech Havir, Adam Oser al Chavero derech Havir. Sorry, one can forbid one's friend even if it's inaccessible. Then we proved, how do we know that Rav says, Ein Adam Oser al Chavero derech Havir, right? How do we know he holds that's not an issue? And right, each time we tried to bring one source, we rejected it, we brought a second source, and then we were able to prove it from there. So now we're going to go on and question Rav about the Ziz case, Shmuel about the Ziz case, and then question Rav about the Churva case. So that's the next section. Amalei Rav Papa LeRava. Papa says to Rava, Lema Shmuel late de Rav Dimi. Are you trying to say, do you think that Shmuel doesn't hold by what Rav Dimi said? Okay, now we're going to see what did Rav Dimi say. Rav Dimi, where Rav Dimi came from Eretz Israel. Remember, he brought the Torah from Israel to Babylonia. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he told us in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Makom she'ein bo arba'a l'arba'a, mutar lebnei reshut harabim u'lebnei reshut hayachid lekatef alav. This is good review. This is what we call it a makom p'tor, an exempt space. If you have something in the reshut harabim, which is not 4x4 wide. Remember, if it's 4x4 wide, already you can put something on it. It's not 4x4 wide. Tosfot has a good language. He says it's tashmish garua. What is tashmish garua? Tashmish garua means it's not so easily usable, right? It's not hard to use, hard to access. So think about it. If you have something that's not 4x4 wide, if you put something on it, it might fall off, right? It's not stable. So that's what we call it's not so usable. Now, what do we say? Because of that, it's called an exempt space. The people in the public domain are allowed to put something on it. The people in the private domain, let's say it's right in between the public and the private, borders on it. So if I'm in my public domain, I can put something on it because it's an exempt space. If I'm in the public, I can put something on it. What can't I do? Right? Ubavad shelo yachlifu. I just can't take my item from my private domain. Let's say I want to get it into the public domain. I put it in the makom p'tor, that's allowed. I move it from the makom p'tor to reshut harabim, to the public. That's not allowed. Even though each step of the way is allowed, altogether, I basically move something from private to public. That I can't do. Now, here we say we allow it, even though it's what we call tashmish gahua. It's not so usable. Likewise, we're going to say, now because of that assumption is because it's not so usable, we're going to allow you to put your items on it and not worry, oh, maybe you'll come to move from private to public. But when it comes to our case of the bore that's in between these two spaces, and to each it's not so usable, and therefore we're not so worried that you're gonna think in a case where it is close to the wall, the bore is close to the walls, and it is easily accessible, you'll be able to. And yet Shmuel says you can't do this because we're worried that maybe you'll think that when it is close to the walls and it is accessible, that each person will be allowed to, and there they really aren't. So why are we stringent in our case, but we're not stringent in this case, okay? It doesn't make any sense. So maybe he just doesn't hold by Rav Dimi. Maybe he thinks that you can't move something to a makom p'tor. You should be worried that maybe yachlifu. So what's the obvious answer? Hatam rishiyot ohaita ahacha rishiyot Rabbanan. When it's from private to public, that's forbidden by Torah law. We're not worried that people are going to accidentally think that I can move from private to public through the exempt space, because everybody knows it's forbidden by Torah law. Torah law people take seriously. But between these two courtyards, it's actually only forbidden midrabanan. We've been through this many times. Between public, right, private to private is actually allowed midrabanan. From my house to your house, there's no reshut harabim in the middle. By Torah law, we can move items. It's just the rabbis forbade it. So therefore, hacha rishiyot Rabbanan, the line that we keep seeing over and over, the chachamim asu chizuk ledivreihem yoter mishal Torah. The rabbis wanted to strengthen their laws more so than Torah laws because, again, there's a bit of always a back and forth here. On the one hand, we're more stringent when it comes to Torah law. On the other hand, when we're worried that maybe somebody will go against Torah law, usually we're not as terribly worried about it as we are that the people will kind of mock, ridicule, or maybe just not take so seriously what the rabbis say. And this is always the problem with rabbinic law, that people don't always take it seriously. So because of that, they wanted to ensure that people take it seriously and don't make a mistake of thinking we could carry from this well when the well was equally accessible to both. Let's say there weren't 4 tvachim of space between each window and the bore. then it would be forbidden, and we don't want people to think that it's allowed, and therefore he requires that we put the z's. Why is it not gzeira? Gzeira, it's a good question, right? So again, where we draw the lines is very, I don't think it's super clear where we draw the lines between when we say we're going to be more stringent with Torah law and put up fences, and where we say we've gone this far with rabbinic, we're not going to make it any more stringent. But it's a bit tricky, and I think a lot I'm assuming it's based on rabbinic intuition, in the sense of what might cause people to make mistakes about things and what might not cause them. There's also a difference. It's when it comes to Torah law, we make a gzeira, that's because we're worried you might make a mistake. Here, we're not so worried you'll make a mistake. Like, we don't let you do something because you might carry it farther. We don't let you. But here, it's that if we allow one scenario, you'll think another scenario is permitted, right? And you'll think, it's not exactly you might actually come to do something by accident. It's more like you might misconstrue and think the halacha is like this. And we want to make sure that you know that you can't do that. So again, where to draw the lines, it's not so clear. And I really think a lot of it is their intuition of what they were concerned about. People would take seriously and people wouldn't take seriously. And maybe that's why in Eruvin it comes up a lot, because maybe they were concerned that people, this whole thing of between, right now at this point, we know, for us, it's so obvious. We don't really think about Doraita, Rabbanan. But in those days, I think people really had much of a better sense of what was rabbinic, what was by Torah. Hopefully now you also have a much better sense after learning Eruvin. But they didn't necessarily have such, they really understood this is Doraita, this is Rabbanan, and maybe people didn't take Eruvin seriously. Remember we had the case of if it's someone who doesn't believe in Eruv, and that there were people who didn't believe in it. And because of that, they had to fight against, it's different. I mean, maybe it's similar also nowadays. There are people who say, distinguish between rabbinic law and Torah law, right? It's part of different denominations of Judaism, where we draw the line, right? Everybody draws the line somewhere. And maybe they were concerned because there were people who were saying, Einam mudim be'eruv, we don't believe in Eruv. Because of that, they had to strengthen this idea to there was more of a reason to strengthen Divrei Chachamim. So it also could be affected by historical circumstances, what I'm saying, and what they see around them and what they see the need is. Okay. So again, you see this, you do see it all over the Gemara, not just in Eruvin, but this idea of the rabbis always concerned that people won't take their words seriously. Right? Like, for example, the big drasha of Lo b'shamayim, why they make such a big deal about that, right? Lo b'shamayim, it's not, we have the power, because everybody knows that rabbis make mistakes, right? Like yaminu small, and if they say, all these issues of trying to say, we hold the power, because if they didn't, you might think, it's a power thing, but it's not. If people didn't believe in rabbinic law, we wouldn't be able, it wouldn't continue Judaism, right? They were basically saying, you have to trust our interpretations, because if you don't trust our interpretations, then we'll be stuck in Torah law, and Torah law is very unclear. You need interpretations. And if you start going by someone else's interpretations, right, we're going to end up with a big, what we call in Hebrew, pitzul ba'am, where everyone's going to be in believing different things. And they didn't want that to happen. And obviously over time, it did happen, even in their time period, and obviously now in our time period. But they were trying to prevent that from happening. Amalei Ravina leRava. So that was our question on Shmuel. Now we're going to have a question on Rav. So Ravina asked Rav, Mi amar Rav hachi, did Rav really say that the avir, right, that we don't forbid the avir? The ha'itma, doesn't it say, Shnei batim, mishnei tzidei reshut harabim? If you have two houses, one on either side of the public domain. Rav bar Rav Huna amar Rav, so here it was said in the name of Rav, asur lizrok mizeh lezeh, you can't throw from one to the other. Ushmuel amar mutar lizrok mizeh lezeh, you can throw from one to the other. Now, wouldn't this be, right, if you can't throw from one to the other, it's because the airspace, right, even though it's going, now the issue here is a little more complicated. Rashi says, if you look, it's much further down on the page, the Dibur Matchil Shnei Batim, okay, Shnei Batim Shel Adam Echad. First of all, he says it's one person's houses. Asur lizrok. V'af al gav, even though dechisage ba'avir reshut harabim lemala me'asara kasagi. Now, when you're throwing from house to house, you're obviously, we're assuming, you're at a height above 10 tefachim. Remember, the height above 10 tefachim in Reshut Harabim is what we call a makom p'tur. So you're throwing it through this exempt space. This reminds us of things we learned in Masechet Shabbat. V'ka'amar oser alav aviran shel b'nei Reshut Harabim af al pi she'ein lahem kan tashmish. What happens? Nobody uses that airspace. And yet, what do we say? Right? The only way you use that airspace is derech avir, by throwing. right? Maybe something you'll throw something, but you don't really use that airspace for anything else. So theoretically, that's a case of derech havir. And what do you see? They forbid each other. So according to Rav, right, Shmuel thinks they don't, and Rav Dafka forbids them. So what do you see here? This is a good case of, right, airspace does forbid. So now they're going to say, oh no, you misunderstood. Amarle, lav miyukimna to midle chad umetate chad. Didn't I already explain? Okay, Rava says, don't you know that that case was explained as a case of one was higher, one was lower. And the issue is not that you're using the airspace. What's the idea of using the airspace? The idea is that the airspace is shared. The airspace is, okay, this house is mine and this house is mine. I throw it through airspace. What does that mean? Well, the airspace is shared with the B'nai Reshut HaRabim. That's why it's forbidden, because it goes, right? I'm really going from one house of mine to the other, but I go through the public, but I'm going through the public in a space that nobody uses. So what do you see here? Even though it's derech havir, the people use it through the airspace, right? It's not very accessible. We're still going to say people have use there, and that's why I can't throw it through there. But Rava says, no, that's not why Rav forbade it. The case is one house high, one house was lower. Now, what's the issue? The issue is zimnin de migandel v'nafil v'atelatuye. We're worried about a side issue. Rav is worried, and we saw this in Masechet Shabbat, that when I throw from one to the other, if one is lower and the other's higher, I'm going to basically end up, it's going to be hard to aim and get it exactly where I want it to land, which means there's a good likelihood it's going to fall right in the middle. But the assumption is if they're on the same level, it'll be easier for me to throw it in. If they're on different levels, it's going to be harder. It might fall on the street. If it falls on the street, what might happen? Now, this goes back to a concern. Maybe I'll end up doing an Isur D'Oraita. I might end up picking it up and bringing it into the house. So because of that concern, Rav forbids it. But that has nothing to do with people using airspace. So therefore, this isn't a question on Rav. Now we're moving on to another topic. And what's good about getting to the end of the Masechet, using an opportunity to remind everyone that we're getting near the end of the Masechet. We have less than 3 weeks to the Siyum. Our Siyum will take place on Sunday, November 22nd. So soon we'll come out with the program and registration, and I hope you'll all come and bring other people who haven't started learning. They can join Masechet Pesachim. Anyway, what's nice about the end of a Masechet is that we are now repeating things that we've already learned, because especially in Masechet like Eruvin, where the topic is really, right, we basically dealt with two main topics, Eruv Chatzerot and Eruv Tchumen, right? And Eruv Chatzerot being Eruv Chatzerot and Shituf Meva'ot. So when we get to the end of the Masechet, we've seen so many things that this is a repeat of something we've seen. So the Mishnah says, Hanotenet Eruvo bebeit shar achsadra umerpeset eno Eruv. If you put your Eruv in a gatehouse, okay, this is, we're going to look at the picture, a little house that's in front of your house that the guard sits in, a little booth, or an achsadra, which is a covered porch that's open, no walls on the sides. It's one interpretation of an achsadra. If you put your Eruv there, or in a merpeset on a porch, ain't no Eruv. It has to be, if you remember, in a place where people live. This Mishnah, by the way, is talking only about Eruv Chatzerot. The Gemara is going to immediately jump and say, what about Shituf Meva'ot? The Hadar Sham, and likewise, and these two things are connected, if someone lives there, let's say I have a house and someone lives in my Beit Shar or Chsadra or Merpeset, then Eino Osel Alav. He doesn't forbid me. He doesn't have to be part of my Eruv because it's not considered a place of living. Beit HaTeven, Beit HaBakar, Beit HaItzim, Beit HaTzahod. If he lives in a storehouse for straw, for hay, for animals, for trees, for anything that I'm storing, basically for fruits, produce, Hareze Eruv. There people more live. It's a place that you could live in, and therefore if somebody lives there, he, number one, I can put an Eruv there, and what goes hand in hand is Hadar Sham Oser. If someone was living there, they would forbid. Those things go hand in hand. If you're living there, you would forbid, then if you can put the Eruv there. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im yesham tfisa yad shabal habayit eino oser. Let's say I have a storage house and someone else is living there, so he can forbid me. But what if I have tfisa yad? We'll get to this tomorrow. What exactly is tfisa yad? But it means some sort of ownership there. I leave stuff there and I come in and out. Okay, that would be some sort of tfisa yad. So Amar Rav Yehuda b'rei Rav Shmuel bar Shilat. So the Gemara starts off and he says something that's quite obvious from what we already saw in the Mishnah. And that's what the Gemara is going to question. He says, any place where they said if you live there, you don't forbid, someone who puts their Eruv is not considered an Eruv, meaning those things go hand in hand. We already said that from the Mishnah. The only exception to the rule is if let's say the only thing in that courtyard is a gate, is this gatehouse, basically, and I live there. I'm the only one in the courtyard. Then, first of all, I'm obviously not forbidding anyone because there's no one in the courtyard. So if I'm not forbidding anyone, then we can actually, let's say I want to make an Eruv with the next door courtyard. I can make an Eruv with them and we can put it in my house, my little gate booth. Even though it's not really a house, in this case, if I'm the only one in the courtyard, we actually can. Now the reverse, if you can't put the Eruv there, now we're going to jump to shituf mava'ot. If you can't put your Eruv there, you can do shituf there. Because shituf, remember, what's the big difference? We talked about this when we talked about what substances you can use, what foods. You have to do bread in the Eruv Chatzera because you're joining people's houses. Therefore, it also has to be in a house where someone can live. When it comes to shituf mava'ot, you're basically joining the common places together, and therefore it doesn't need to be in a place where you live. There's a big debate among the Rishonim. Do we say that shituf mava'ot has to be in an outer space, like a courtyard, or something like a Beit Shar or something like that? Or can it also be in a house? Okay, there's a big debate about a house. Can it go in a house, or maybe it can't go in a house at all, and it has to be in a more outdoor space? That the Gemara doesn't discuss, but it's unclear from the Gemara what that would be. So here they just say all the spaces you can't use for Eruv, you can use for shituf. So except for, they're also going to have an exception here. Beit Shar, where I got lost here. Okay. The only one place you can't put a shituf is in the airspace of the mavoy, which we're going to see in another minute, is because it's not protected from the people in the public domain. Because the mavoy opens, the alley opens to the public, we're worried that someone might take it or do something with it. It's not protected. So it can't go in the mavoy, but it can go anywhere else. So my kamashna, what are you teaching us? Tanina, it already says this in the Mishnah. So what do you learn here? Eruv delo have, hashituf have. Seems obvious from the Mishnah. You can't use these for Eruv, but you can obviously use them for shituf. Now, it didn't necessarily say that, but they assume it's obvious. So why did he make this statement? Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Shmuel bar Shilat, he said it to teach you the exceptions. He wanted to teach you the exceptions, because those exceptions were not mentioned in the Mishnah. Tanya Namihach, here's another support. We're now basically going to bring supports for the fact that shituf mevo'ot can be done in all those spaces where you can't do Eruv. Now, this source says you could put an Eruv in your Beit Shar, all the places we just said in the Mishnah you can't. So they say, V'hatnan ein ze Eruv, but it says this isn't Eruv. So they say, oh, ema harei ze shituf. So I must be talking about shituf, and that's why. But then they ask, wait a minute, but look at the last item. Shituf mavoy lo mintar. But you can't do shituf in a mavoy. It says there you could also do it in a mavoy in the alley. So they say, ema b'chatzer sheba mavoy. When it says u'b'chatzer of a mavoy, it means a chatzer that's in the mavoy. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, he brings another halacha. We learned this also before. B'nei chavura shayu mesubin. If people were eating, v'kidesh aleim hayom, and all of a sudden Shabbat came in, and they didn't do their Eruv. Patch al shulchan somchim alav mishum Eruv. If they were all eating together and they were all part of the Eruv, they can say, oh, the bread that we're eating, this is our Eruv, because we're all together. V'amrei la mishum shituf. And some people say they can use that bread for shituf mevo'ot. So, Amar Rabba v'lo pligi, kam b'misubim b'bayit, kam b'misubim b'chatzer. Again, another source that proves it all depends where you are. If you're in the house, then it meant Eruv Chatzera. If they were eating in the courtyard, then it would mean for shituf mavot because you can't do Eruv in the courtyard. So now he says, I want to bring a braita to prove what you're saying, that it's a difference, right? That Eruv goes in the house and the shituf goes in the courtyard. Okay, so it says you could do the Eruv Chatzerot in the Chatzer and the shituf in the mavoy. Okay, this sounds totally against what we just said. How could you do Eruv Chatzerot in the Chatzer? Doesn't it say Hanotenet Eruvo b'Beit Sharach Sadrum or Peset Eino Eruv? Right? Didn't we just say you can't do that in our Mishnah? How did that source say that? Again, one could say, by the way, I want to point this out. Maybe the Tanaitic sources, maybe it was a debate in Tanaitic times, but to the Gemara, it can't possibly be. So what do? They reread the source. Ema Eruvei Chatzerot b'Bayit shebechatzer, Shitufei Mevot b'Chatzer shebamavoy. Okay, so when it says Eruv Chatzerot b'Chatzer, it means in the house, in the courtyard. And Shituf Mavod in the Mavoy means in a courtyard in the Mavoy. Okay, and that's how they prove Rabbah that that's what he said. Each one goes in their own space. So this was to bring all these sources that prove that Eruv goes in your place that's ra'oi for living, and shituf goes in all the other spaces. Again, like I said, there's a big debate about whether it can also go in your house or not. That's not mentioned in the Gemara. The Gemara just kind of says it goes in the courtyard, but it's not so clear what they would say about the house. And like I said a minute ago, it could be in Tannaitic times, there were different approaches to this, but to the Gemara, their agenda is very clear that shituf, right, can't go in the alley and Eruv can't go in the courtyard. Okay, well, and with that, have a good day, everyone.